yesterday, the Gemara talked about preferences of which brachas, which food should the bracha be recited upon, because we want to recite the bracha on the best food possible. And there are a number of options when it comes to considering something more significant. Something that's complete is significant. Something that's bigger might be significant. Something that is more in a spiritual sense better. Like, for example, it's one of the species that Israel is blessed with is better. And the Gemara mentions the case of if you have slices of bread or a complete bread. And we had this argument of Rav Huna, Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav Huna had mentioned that you recite it on the pieces. Rabbi Yochanan said you recite it on a complete one. And but then they said that if there is a slice of wheat bread and a complete one of barley bread, everyone would agree that you would recite the bracha on the wheat bread, even though it's a slice, it's a piece, and that would exempt the complete loaf of the barley, because wheat comes before barley in the 7 species, and therefore it has precedence. It's considered more significant. And the way Taisvis over here learns that we're even talking about where this is a small piece of wheat bread versus a large loaf of barley bread. Nevertheless, you would recite the bracha on the piece of wheat bread because the wheat bread comes first, takes precedence. Now, Taisvis brings in a very interesting halacha, and that is that is a person allowed to eat bread baked by a non-Jew? And the answer is no. We're not allowed to. The rabbis made a decree that we are not allowed to have bread baked by a non-Jew because the rabbis wanted to prevent intermarriage. And there is discussion in the Shulchan Aruch and in the commentaries regarding bread baked by a baker. So what I mean to say is that there's one thing having bread baked by a non-Jew who's your next door neighbor, and there's a difference between going to a bakery and you have bread baked by a baker that's like more of a business having such bread. What's the difference? Well, obviously, if bread is baked by your next door neighbor, it's going to be more personal relationship that it could bring to intermarriage. If you are invited to your next door neighbors for, to break bread together, so there definitely could be room, could lead to intermarriage. But a baker is a little, maybe less of a severe, the severity is a little different because you don't necessarily develop a relationship. It's a bakery, this is the business. And additionally, the fact is that bread is something that people live on, and the rabbis were possibly lenient in a case of bread to be able to buy it from a non-Jew so that you have food to live on. So there is discussion in the commentaries about the leniency of a baker. Would that apply only if you do not have any other kosher bread from a Jewish baker, from a baked by a Jew, or does it apply anywhere? Is that leniency a blanket leniency, and you can just simply buy bread that's baked by a non-Jew? And it's really a very practical question, because nowadays all of the supermarkets, you can buy bread that has an OU on it, or it has a Chaf K or an OK. The breads, there are a lot of breads companies that have rabbinic supervision. And what they're telling you is that that bread is made from kosher products. However, they are not necessarily baked by a Jew. It could be that a non-Jew turns on the fire in those places. So the popular bread when I was growing up was Arnold's. I don't know if it's still popular, but
yeah, it is.
Arnold's was a very popular bread, and that was not baked by a Jew. It was kosher. I don't know if it is now kosher, but it was kosher then. And anyway, so
Still is, Rabbi.
Still is, okay. And in any event, that would be a case. Now, if you live in Mississippi and there's no Jewish bakery there and there's no place to buy bread, that would be a case where you're stuck. You buy the Arnold's bread and you're all set. You're relying on a leniency, and that's an accepted leniency, and you're in a place where there is no other kosher bread to buy. And so you have the Arnold's bread or whatever other company they sell, and you buy that and you're all set. However, what happens if you live in South Florida or you live in Chicago, where there is a kosher bakery, there is bread to buy that's baked by a Jew, and do you have the same, do you have that same leniency? And this is an argument among the rabbis. Are you allowed to take advantage of this leniency, or does it only apply when there's no other bread available? Is this a leniency based on need, or is this a leniency based on law? If it's based on need, in the case of in Florida, South Florida, there's no excuse. You have a lot of kosher bread out there. Should you be relying on this leniency? So obviously there are some people that will rely on it, and others that won't rely on it. You have both. As with everything Jewish, you always have two opinions. Yes, Yehuda.
Well, in North Miami Beach, there was a bakery for years, Abraham's,
Right.
that was owned by Seventh-day Adventists.
But they had I believe the original bakery that was right near Jerusalem Pizza.
Right.
That bakery, I believe at one point it was owned by Jews, and then they sold it to their workers, if I'm not mistaken, who might have been Seventh-day Adventists. Am I wrong?
Well, since I've been down here,
it was always owned. By the Seventh-day Adventists. Now,
but they had supervision. They had kosher supervision.
Was it 24/7 supervision?
Oh, I don't know.
Now, if it was 24/7 supervision, in other words, if they had constant supervision, then the rabbi would have obviously turned on the fire. But most, these big commercial bakeries, they don't need 24/7 supervision. They need a rabbi to pop in and out randomly and just make sure, because it's there's a protocol and procedures how they so in those cases they don't have a rabbi on staff 24/7 to turn on the fire, and that's where you have bread baked by a non-Jew. But in this place, if I always remember seeing over there like a Jewish man that was always behind the somewhere that was there. So, and I believed, I thought at first he was the owner, but maybe not. In any event, he would have turned on the fire. So there we had no, we didn't have an issue. But the problem is the bread you buy in Publix or in Aldi's that does have supervision, but it does have supervision that it's kosher. But should you be relying on that, being that there is other bread available, because like Florida Kosher sells Pas Yisrael bread,
Right.
and they have a bakery there, and amazing savings. These places and the Jewish stores here have deliveries of the pita breads that are baked by a Jew, and so on. So there is a lot of bread available here in South Florida that the question would be, should you be relying on this leniency? Yes, Ben.
I wanted to know, do we know how much that ruling helped really to stop intermarriage, and how much it encouraged intermarriage in places where there is no kosher bakery? They said, okay, we can't follow that law. Leave me alone. I have to eat bread. And
keep in mind that the main law applied to personal household bread, and in that case there wasn't leniency, and so we don't have places where they would eat bread from the. In other words, the main purpose of the decree applied to more of a household baked bread.
Yeah.
And we don't have you can't make that statistics, because we don't have a place where people would eat household bread.
From today's numbers of intermarriage, we have to question, how much it really helped.
It really helped. I would think a lot, because in the olden days, when they followed these laws, how much intermarriage you think there was? I would say probably less than less than a fraction of a percent.
So how did we get to today's
intermarriage?
Numbers?
What?
How did we get
to? Because people eat bread that's not kosher and not Pas Yisrael, not based on There's a lot of people who don't follow Torah.
Yeah.
And if the parents don't follow the Torah, how do you expect the kid? How do you expect the kids to keep it? And see, the problem is, it's funny, because it's funny, it's sad, really. I was sitting next to someone on an airplane from Eretz Yisrael many years ago, maybe about 30 years ago, and he was telling me that he was brought up in a family that wasn't religious; they were Jewish, and when he married a Chinese woman, he said that his father physically had a heart attack. And then he passed away. And he said, but he was a hypocrite, because he didn't bring us up with anything Jewish. Why shouldn't he marry a Chinese woman? What was wrong with that? We didn't go to shul on the Shabbos or the holidays. What was wrong with marrying? He couldn't differentiate between intermarriage and keeping any of the other laws.
Yeah.
In other words, once you don't keep these laws, why should intermarriage be a problem? He couldn't, this person I was sitting next to, you couldn't see a problem. He was shocked that his father died. Initially had a heart attack, and I guess that led to his death. But he couldn't understand why it affected his father so much if they didn't appreciate, anything else about Yiddishkeit. Why should he have cared? So, in any event, keeping these smaller laws, you could say, are very important. It keeps us. There are each of these fences that are placed here. There's a reason why they're. What happens if you don't keep them? They're there for a reason. Yes, Ezra.
So why couldn't the man understand that perhaps what happened with his father was his father's realization that what he did caused all of this. And that's the reason why he had the heart attack.
Well, I guess he didn't keep kosher afterwards, even after his heart attack. You know, he didn't start going to shul.
So it wouldn't, you know, it's
You know,
going
no.
to shul would be like closing the barn door after the horses escaped. It, you know, it's after the fact and wouldn't have done anything. What was he going to
No,
do?
if he realized he's wrong, in other words, you know, if maybe the son would have understood his father better if his father started keeping laws afterwards. So the son would have understood, he realized that everything was a domino effect from not keeping these, and this is more severe, but he didn't. He saw his father has no, you know, significant, doesn't feel Judaism is significant. So what should it make a difference if I do this, if I go against this law or that law? It's none of it is really important. He didn't see that something could be more, you know, integral than other parts. You know, he saw it. It's either do it or don't do it.
Did he say anything about the time period between the heart attack and his father passing away?
You know, and it's so many years ago. I don't remember the details. I mean,
yeah, but you know, as they say, the devil is in the details.
Okay. In any event, you know, I can't. I don't know. It is as it is. The story is that's the story, but doesn't, you know, it's not going to change anything. I don't know the statistics, Ben, but I think we definitely, you
It
know,
helps some.
it definitely is a big thing. I mean, food is a major attraction. In fact, you know, what's interesting is I saw a video where the Rebbe was mentioning to someone about starting a food kitchen. I think it was like a Hillel kosher kitchen at a college. And the Rebbe told him that the reason I want you to do this is so that, let me just mute everyone here. The reason I want you to do that is so that this person, the Jewish students at the college, they'll eat a kosher meal, and they'll sit next to a girl who's kosher, and they'll marry a Jewish woman. Instead of them sitting next to a guy eating treif, they'll come and sit next to a Jew, and they'll eat kosher and marry a Jewish spouse. And so the man who the Rebbe was talking to says, "Oh, and we could have shiurim, Torah classes at this, you know, when we open it up." So the Rebbe said, that wasn't my intention. My intention was simply that they should, you know, that at least they'll eat kosher and marry a Jew. You know, you want to take it a step further, that's great. But let's, you know, bottom line is let's let them marry, let them just eat kosher and be happy to marry a Jew. And that was my goal. That was my intent.
Let me give you an example of something opposite. We were on a trip to Italy, and in the restaurant in the hotel, they roped up an area for kosher eating for the kosher people in the hotel. And every morning, a guy would come in and eat his chazar in that area. He insisted on going into the Jewish area and eating his food.
And did anyone marry that guy?
Nobody else went in there when he was in there. They tried to get him out, even the hotel, you know, he refused. He didn't want to go out.
So that's it.
So I'm saying, you know, they know it, and they really, sometimes they do it on purpose, you know.
But that's ultimately the mission, the goal was fulfilled by no one's going to be interested in marrying some guy who forces his way in against the rules. You know what I mean? Ultimately, the mission was accomplished by separating, by not eating together. It definitely is.
He didn't realize that he's really hurting his cause. You know?
Right.
Rabbi.
So Yes,
Rabbi.
Moshe. Yes, Moshe.
I've heard that people who don't eat, not if it's about Pas Yisrael, but if it's not Kemach Yashan, you're like a goy. If you eat bread that's not Kemach Yashan, it's like you're a goy. It's like you're eating chazer. I've heard many.
You're talking to the wrong people, Moshe. You got to stop talking to. Listen, anyone can make
these
up.
Are Rebbeim. I mean, these are some Rebbeim. I don't want to mention who the rabbi is, but he said if you don't eat Kemach Yashan, it's like you're eating chazer.
Well, sorry to say, this rabbi, I don't know who it is, but it's not really advisable to follow. I mean, he's obviously maybe talking to his congregation, maybe his community, maybe it could be maybe he's Sephardic, and Sephardic people they follow a certain halacha in their you know what I mean, in their circles. They don't have a leniency of not Yashan, so maybe he's Sephardic. But if he's Ashkenazic, then he's definitely off track, because in Ashkenazic Jewry, the majority of Ashkenazic religious, very from Yidden, do not keep Kemach Yashan. There's huge leniencies on Kemach Yashan. Of course, there's a halacha about it. And of course, in Israel is another story, but outside of Israel is it's not a chumrah. You could do it, but you don't talk to talk like that against anyone who does it is eating chazer. I mean, that's very extreme, and not acknowledging that there are huge sources that it's not a necessity outside of Israel when there's no Beis Hamikdash. So, in any event, the reason I'm bringing this law about Pas Yisrael, bread of a non-Jew, is because Tosfos deals with it in a sense that what happens if you have bread baked by a baker who's a non-Jew. It's called a palter. Palter means a non-Jewish baker, and versus bread that is baked by a Jewish baker. Does one take precedence over the other? And of course, we're talking according to the lenient view that when you have both, even if you have bread baked by a Jew, you can be lenient as long as it's a baker. You can also eat bread baked by a non-Jewish baker. According to that leniency, which one does one take precedence over the other? And the point behind this is, does spiritual benefit also is that also taken into consideration? In other words, this is not something that's maybe tastes better, but maybe because of there are opinions that because there is obviously a preference. There should be some preference in having bread baked by a Jewish baker. So, or at least according to some opinions, in places where you do have other bread available. So would that take precedence over bread baked by a non-Jewish baker? That's an interesting question. In other words, you follow the lenient view. You follow a view that you're allowed to have bread baked by a non-Jewish baker. You're following that view. Is there a preference to have bread baked by a Jewish baker, or is it totally permissible? And Tosfos does talk about that, and the Tosfos that he deals with this is in the Tosfos called Avol, the third Tosfos on the page, and he starts off by telling us that why is wheat flour better than barley, wheat bread better than barley bread? And he says, well, the reason for it is not because wheat bread tastes better than barley bread. It's because spiritually, wheat is better than barley. Why is wheat better than barley? Because in the verse of the 7 species, wheat is first. So it has a spiritual benefit over barley. So he says, so a spiritual benefit is also a reason to give precedence to it, rather than just something that tastes better or you like better, or it's more significant physically. Spiritual elements to it are also taken into consideration, and that's why a piece of wheat bread would take precedence over a whole loaf of barley bread. And better you should recite the bracha on the piece of the wheat bread over the whole loaf of the barley bread. Then he talks about what happens when you have wheat that's made from very fine flour versus bread made from wheat that's more of a coarse flour. In the case that he mentions, he says, what happens if the one made from fine flour is only a piece, and the one made from the coarse flour is a shalem, is complete? And so on the one hand, you would think complete, a whole loaf is better. On the other hand, fine flour, bread made from fine flour, is going to be better than bread made from coarse flour. So you got these contradictory preferences. So he brings from the Tosefta that he says if you have that you should, if they're both the same, if you have fine flour bread and coarse flour bread, and they're both shalem, they're both complete, you should choose the fine flour bread because that is more preferred. But what happens if you have a piece of the fine flour in a complete bread of coarse flour? Then the complete bread takes precedence. Then it talks about in the Tosefta, pas kosher and pas shel nachri. When you have bread that is made from a Jewish baker and bread made from a Goyish baker, which one comes first? So you should first recite the bracha on the kosher, on the one made from the Jewish baker. And then he brings in the Yerushalmi, you have bread that is tahor and bread that is tameh. Tahor means pure, and tameh means impure. It was touched by something that's impure, or someone who was impure touched it. Now, according to Jewish law, you're allowed to eat bread that is tameh, that is impure. Of course, not a kohen, but if you're a regular Levite or Israelite, you're allowed to eat bread that is tahor, that is tameh, but is impure. But what happens when you have pure bread and impure bread? So the law is you should recite the bracha on the pure bread, on the tahor bread. Now, what happens if the bread of the goy is chaviv? What happens if you like the goyish bread better because it tastes better? So the goy baked it. He's more a professional baker, and his bread tastes better. Arnold's whatever hamburger rolls taste better, and it's more nucky. It's fine flour. It's made from fine flour, and you have Has Yisrael, bread from a Jew, but it's not as it doesn't taste as good. It's not chaviv. You don't cherish it. So in this case, Tosfos initially says you recite the whichever one you like better, and this would be because you have two preferences that are negating each other. On the one hand, you have a better bread physically. On the other hand, you have spiritually a better bread. You have bread baked by a goy, but it tastes better. Bread baked by a yid, it's spiritually better. So each one, so in that case, you have the two preferences that are negating each other. You do whichever one you want. And Then Tosfos brings Rabbeinu Shimshon said, you know what you really should do is remove the bread that from the goy from the table until after you recite Hamaitzi, and in this way you don't have a problem because it's not in front of you when you recite the Hamaitzi. So you would recite the bracha on the bread from the Jew, and you don't have this problem of which one to recite the bracha on. So these are the discussions that Gemara and the commentaries are dealing with here. We're dealing with the preferences, and it's important to know that what is considered a preference, and these are all also areas supposed to be taken into consideration. Coarse flour versus fine flour, pas Yisrael versus pas palter. Pas Yisrael means bread baked by a Jew. Pas palter means bread baked by a non-Jewish baker. Bread that's tahar, pure, bread that's tameh. Again, a Jew is allowed to eat bread that's tameh, but it's of course better to eat bread baked by bread that is tahar, that is pure. Of course, nowadays it doesn't apply, this idea of pure and impure. It applied in the time of the Beis Hamikdash when people used to eat truma and they had to be pure, and people would go to the Beis Hamikdash. They needed purity, and therefore the laws of purity and impurity were much more applicable in those days than they are today. Today they do apply to a kohen, but not to the extent that they applied in the time of the Beis Hamikdash. But it is interesting. We know the story of Avraham Avinu, that he wanted to serve his guests. Shalosh ki'im kemach soilas. He wanted to bring his guests to make ugos. They wanted to make these loaves for the guests. And Sarah, his wife, Sarah, she had become a nida that day. She became a nida. She menstruated, even though she was 89 years old, but she menstruated, and therefore, if she baked the bread, it would have been impure. Now, of course, nowadays this doesn't apply. A woman could bake bread even if she's impure, but Avraham was careful to only eat pure bread. So therefore, they didn't serve. That's why in the story of Avraham serving the three angels, he didn't end up serving bread, because he was careful to eat only pure bread. And that's why they didn't serve bread to the angels, even though initially he wanted bread. He wanted to serve them bread. Okay, so that just gives us a little understanding of the different cases, scenarios of what's considered preferable and what's not. And tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem will continue. See you later, everyone. Have a question?
Thank you, Rabbi.
I have one question about sliced bread.
Yeah.
So today you get, I like sliced, but today you get everything, you can have it sliced and it's all contained in one plastic bag. You can see through it. You can see it's a whole loaf. Can you hold that up and use that?
Like on Shabbos?
Yeah, you can't.
On Shabbos, would you use that for Lechem Mishnah? So right. You're not supposed to. That's not really appropriate. If you have nothing else, there is an option of putting some type of, maybe like a knife in the middle of it and attaching it all together so it's all attached. You might be able to stick a fork or a knife in the middle of the loaf and stick like all the bread pieces through it, like a spit. Yeah, some type of like a spit, or stick some type of a chopstick through it. And this way, it's all attached together. That would be in a case where you have no other choice because you have no other bread. Then you would do something like that to make it considered.
Okay, so not really, in other words.
That's not the it's not preferred.
Can always find the matzah.
All right. Bye, Rabbi.
Okay. Sei gesund, everyone.